Sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing outlaws, but from showing mercy to a creature that could kill you. In harsh Utah territory of the 1870s, most men would put a bullet in the broken mountain lion lying at the cliff's base. But one cowboy chose differently. For 38 days, he sheltered the battered predator in his barn, nursing it back to health with scarce medicine and food scraps. His neighbors called him a fool for keeping such a dangerous beast alive. They whispered that no good could come from showing kindness to something wild. Yet as the lion slowly regained its strength, something unexpected happened between man and beast. What happens when the time comes to set free the very creature you've saved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Coyote Canyon like an old man's breath in winter air, and Samuel Hartwell moved through it with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned that the frontier rewarded those who listened more than they spoke. At 34, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who had seen both war and loss, each crease telling a story he rarely shared with the few souls who crossed his path. His ranch sat tucked into a natural fold of red sandstone walls, where a spring-fed creek provided enough water for a modest herd of cattle and the vegetable garden that kept him fed through the long Utah winters. The cabin he had built with his own hands stood solid against the elements, its thick log walls chinked with mud and grass, windows facing east to catch the first light of dawn. It was a simple life, chosen deliberately after too many years of following orders and watching good men die for causes that seemed smaller with each passing season. Samuel had served 5 years in the cavalry before mustering out and heading west, carrying little more than his discharge papers, a worn leather journal that had belonged to his father, and memories he preferred to keep buried. The journal, cracked and stained from years of use, contained his father's careful observations about treating wounded animals. Dr. Ezra Hartwell had been a country physician in Missouri, a man who believed that healing was a calling that extended beyond human patience. A creature in pain recognizes kindness regardless of its source, his father had written in neat script across pages that Samuel had read countless times. The ability to mend what is broken, whether man or beast, is a gift that demands respect, not pride. Those words had guided Samuel through his years as a cavalry medic, where he had learned to set bones, stitch wounds, and ease suffering with whatever supplies could be scrounged from a harsh land. They had also guided him through the darkest period of his life, when his young wife Margaret had died in childbirth 3 years prior, taking with her not only their unborn son, but also Samuel's faith that the world rewarded goodness with anything other than pain. The ranch had been Margaret's dream as much as his own. She had loved the idea of raising children where they could see mountains touch the sky and learn that hard work and honest living were their own rewards. After her death, Samuel had continued building the life they had planned, partly from stubborn determination and partly because he had nowhere else to go. The work kept his hands busy and his mind focused on tasks that had clear beginnings and endings, unlike the questions that haunted his sleep. His daily routine had become a ritual of survival and maintenance. Each morning he would check the fence lines, tend to his small herd of cattle, and walk the perimeter of his property, looking for signs of predators or damaged fencing. The animals depended on him, and that dependence gave his days structure and purpose. He had learned to read the land like a book, noting where the grass grew thickest, where water pooled after rain, and where dangerous animals might shelter during harsh weather. It was during one of these morning inspections that Samuel's life took a turn he could never have anticipated. The autumn air carried a bite that promised winter was not far off, and frost clung to the grass where shadows lingered. He had been checking a section of fencing near the base of the towering limestone cliff that formed the eastern boundary of his property when he heard it, a sound that was part growl, part whimper, and entirely unlike anything that belonged. In his ordered world, Following the sound led him to a sight that stopped him cold. At the base of the cliff, where rockfall had created a natural depression, lay a mountain lion unlike any he had ever seen. The animal was massive, easily 140 pounds of muscle and bone, but it lay twisted in a way that spoke of catastrophic injury. One hind leg bent at an impossible angle, ribs clearly broken beneath its tawny coat, and deep gashes marked where the creature had struck stone during its fall. Samuel's first instinct was the same as any sensible man's would have been, to put the animal out of its misery with a single bullet and be done with it. Mountain lions were killers, apex predators that had no business being cared for by human hands. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to end its suffering quickly and drag the carcass far enough from his property that it would not attract scavengers. But as he drew his revolver, the animal's eyes found his, and Samuel saw something that gave him pause. There was intelligence there, and a dignity that seemed at odds with the creature's broken condition. The lion was conscious, clearly in agony, but it made no move to attack or even bare its teeth. It simply watched him with golden eyes that seemed to hold a question he could not quite understand. Samuel found himself thinking of his father's journal, of all the entries describing wounded animals that had been nursed back to health with patience and skill. He thought of Margaret, who had once spent 3 days caring for an injured sparrow she had found in their garden, fashioning a tiny splint from twigs and feeding it drops of sugar water until it could fly again. "You cannot mend every broken thing in this world," she had told him when he questioned the wisdom of such efforts, "but that does not mean you should not try to mend what you can." The decision, when it came, surprised him with its certainty. Samuel holstered his gun and approached the mountain lion with the same careful movements he had used to approach wounded soldiers on the battlefield. The animal's breathing was labored but steady, and when Samuel knelt beside it, he could see that while the injuries were severe, they might not be fatal if properly treated. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice carrying the calm authority he had learned during his military service. "Let's see what we can do for you." Working slowly and deliberately, Samuel began to assess the damage. The broken leg would need to be set and splinted, the gashes cleaned and bandaged, and the animal would require shelter, food, and constant care. It was a monumental undertaking, one that would consume his time, his resources, and possibly his safety. Every practical bone in his body told him he was making a mistake. But as he gently touched the lion's uninjured shoulder and felt the animal relax slightly under his hand, Samuel knew he had made his choice. He would try to save this magnificent creature, not because it made sense, but because his father's wisdom and his wife's compassion had taught him that some things were worth doing simply because they were right. The first challenge was getting the unconscious lion to his barn without causing further injury. Samuel fashioned a crude travois from fence posts and canvas, then spent the better part of an hour carefully maneuvering the animal onto the makeshift stretcher. The lion remained unconscious throughout the process, its breathing shallow but regular. By the time Samuel had dragged his unexpected patient to the barn and created a temporary recovery area using hay bales and clean horse blankets, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist. He stood looking down at the broken mountain lion, acutely aware that he had just committed himself to a course of action that would test everything he had learned about healing, patience, and the strange courage required to show mercy to something that could destroy him without effort. In his pocket, his father's journal seemed to carry extra weight, as if the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent mending broken things was preparing to be tested once again. Samuel pulled out the worn leather book and opened it to a passage he had memorized long ago. "The measure of a man's character is not found in his strength, but in how he treats those who cannot defend themselves." As Samuel began to gather the supplies he would need for the days ahead, he wondered if his father had ever imagined that those words would one day guide his son's hand as he tended to one of nature's most fearsome predators. The mountain lion stirred slightly in its makeshift bed, and Samuel felt the first stirring of something he had not experienced since Margaret's death. Hope that his efforts might actually make a difference in the outcome of another creature's story. 2 days passed in watchful silence before the mountain lion stirred to consciousness, and when it did, Samuel learned the difference between caring for a wounded animal and caring for a wounded predator. The transformation was instant and terrifying. One moment the creature lay still as death, the next it was a snarling, thrashing embodiment of pure panic and rage. Samuel had been changing the water in the shallow pan he kept near the lion's makeshift bed when golden eyes snapped open and fixed on him with predatory intensity. The animal's survival instincts, undimmed by injury, immediately identified Samuel as a threat. Despite its broken condition, the lion lunged forward with startling speed, jaws snapping closed mere inches from Samuel's arm as he threw himself backward. The effort cost the animal dearly. Its shattered hind leg, held together by the crude splint Samuel had fashioned from fence slats and torn cloth, twisted beneath the lion's weight. The creature collapsed with a roar that seemed to shake the barn's rafters, its breathing coming in sharp, pained gasps. But even in its agony, the lion's eyes never left Samuel's face, and the message was clear: approach at your own peril. For the better part of an hour, they remained locked in that standoff. Samuel sat perfectly still on an overturned milk crate, speaking in low, steady tones, while the lion watched him with the focused attention of a creature calculating its chances of survival. The animal's injuries were more extensive than Samuel had initially realized. Beyond the obviously shattered leg, which bore bone fragments that would never heal properly without careful setting, there were deep gashes along its ribs where the cliff face had torn through hide and muscle. "Easy there, friend," Samuel murmured, using the same voice he had employed to calm spooked horses during cavalry charges. "I know this doesn't make sense to you, but I'm trying to help." The lion's response was a low growl that rumbled like distant thunder. Its magnificent head, marked by scars that spoke of previous encounters with both prey and predator, remained raised despite the obvious pain the posture caused. This was not an animal accustomed to showing weakness, and Samuel realized he was witnessing something rare: a wild creature's struggle to maintain dignity in the face of absolute vulnerability. As the morning wore on, Samuel began to understand the true scope of the challenge he had undertaken. The lion refused all food, turning its head away from the raw beef Samuel offered, and baring its teeth whenever he approached too closely. Water was accepted only when Samuel retreated to the far side of the barn, allowing the animal to drink without feeling cornered. It was during one of these cautious feeding attempts that Tom Brennan arrived, his weathered face appearing in the barn doorway like a harbinger of the complications Samuel had known would inevitably follow. Tom was Samuel's closest neighbor, a practical man who had survived 3 decades on the frontier by making sensible decisions and avoiding unnecessary risks. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Tom breathed when he saw the mountain lion. "Samuel, what in the name of all that's holy are you thinking?" Samuel straightened slowly, his movements careful and deliberate to avoid startling the animal further. "I'm thinking this creature was hurt and needed help." "That creature," Tom said, stepping into the barn but staying well clear of the hay bale. "Enclosure is a stone-cold killer. I've seen what lions can do to cattle, to horses, to men for that matter. You're playing with fire here, Samuel." "The fire's already been lit," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that surprised them both. "The question now is whether I let it burn out naturally or try to put it out myself." Tom studied his friend's face, noting the determined set of his jaw and the way Samuel's eyes never left the lion for more than a few seconds. "This isn't about the animal, is it?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Samuel had known Tom long enough to trust him with difficult truths, but this particular truth was still too raw, too uncertain for words. Instead, he focused on the practical aspects of the situation. "The leg needs proper setting," Samuel said, gesturing toward the makeshift splint. "Those gashes need cleaning and stitching, and the animal needs to eat, or all of this becomes academic. You know anything about setting a mountain lion's broken leg?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I know about setting broken legs," Samuel replied. "The principles don't change much between species." Over the next several hours, Tom watched Samuel work with a patience and skill that spoke of experience with traumatic injuries. Using techniques learned during his military service, Samuel fashioned a more sophisticated splint system for the lion's shattered hind leg, working carefully around bone fragments that could have easily severed major blood vessels if handled improperly. The lion tolerated these ministrations with stoic endurance, as if understanding that its survival depended on accepting help from this strange, gentle predator who offered healing instead of harm. When Samuel finally managed to properly align the broken bones and secure them with a rigid splint made from seasoned oak strips, the animal's relief was visible in the way its breathing deepened and its constant vigilance relaxed slightly. "I'll give you this," Tom admitted as they stepped outside the barn for a break. "You've got the touch for it, but Samuel, you need to think about what comes next. That animal's going to get stronger, and when it does, it's going to remember that it's a predator and your prey." Samuel wiped his hands on a clean rag, noting the blood that stained his fingers, some his own from minor scratches, some belonging to the lion. "Maybe it's going to remember that I helped it when it needed help." "Animals don't think like that," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't they?" Samuel asked. "I've seen horses remember kindness and cruelty both. I've seen dogs that would die before betraying someone who showed them mercy. Why should a mountain lion be different?" Tom had no ready answer for that, but his concerns extended beyond the philosophical. "Word's gonna get out about this, Samuel. You know how people talk. A man keeping a mountain lion in his barn, folks are going to have opinions about that." As, if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses carried across the canyon, Samuel recognized the measured cadence of Sheriff John Morrison's mount, accompanied by what sounded like 2 or 3 other riders. Tom grimaced and shook his head. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man, elected more for his ability to keep the peace than for any particular talent with a gun. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded him daily that he was no longer young, and his expression suggested this was not a social call. "Samuel," he said with a nod. "Tom, heard you might have yourself a situation." "Here. Depends on how you define situation," Samuel replied evenly. "Well, let's start with the reports that you've got a mountain lion in your barn." "That true?" Samuel met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "It is." "Injured animal," Tom added quickly. "Samuel's trying to help it heal up." Sheriff Morrison removed his hat and ran a hand through thinning hair. "Samuel, I've known you for 3 years now, and you've always struck me as a man with good sense. But this is something different entirely. That animal's a danger to everyone in the area." "The animal can barely stand," Samuel pointed out. "It's hardly in condition to threaten anyone. Today, maybe. But what about next week? Next month? You planning to keep a full-grown mountain lion as a pet?" The question struck closer to home than Samuel cared to admit. He had been so focused on the immediate challenge of keeping the lion alive that he had avoided thinking about the longer-term implications of his choice. What would he do when the animal recovered? Could it ever be safely returned to the wild? Was he prepared to care for it indefinitely? "I'm planning to help a hurt creature heal," Samuel said finally. "Beyond that, I'll make decisions as they need to be made." Sheriff Morrison studied Samuel's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. I can't say I understand it, but it's your property and your choice. Just remember that if that animal hurts someone, the responsibility falls on your shoulders." As the sheriff and his companions rode away, Samuel found himself standing at a crossroads he had not fully anticipated. The lion in his barn represented more than just an injured animal. It had become a symbol of his own struggle to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to break everything good it contained. That evening, as Samuel sat watching the lion take its first tentative sips of water from the carved wooden bowl his father had made years before, he began to understand that he had named the creature in his mind without conscious thought. Canyon, after the place where he had found it, seemed fitting for an animal that embodied both the harsh beauty and unexpected vulnerability of the land Samuel had chosen to call home. Canyon's golden eyes, no longer filled with panic, watched Samuel with what might have been curiosity. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. The first week of caring for Canyon established a rhythm that reshaped Samuel's entire existence around the needs of a creature that should have been his natural enemy. Each dawn brought a careful assessment of the lion's condition, checking for signs of infection in the wounds, monitoring the stability of the splint, and observing the subtle changes in behavior that might indicate improvement or decline. Canyon's appetite remained a persistent concern. The lion would only accept food when Samuel retreated to the far corner of the barn, allowing the animal to maintain the illusion of independence even in its helpless state. Samuel had begun butchering one of his steers in small portions, offering fresh meat twice daily in the carved wooden bowl that had belonged to his father. The bowl, worn smooth by decades of use, seemed to bridge the gap between human civilization and wild nature in ways that metal or ceramic never could. Dr. Ezra Hartwell had carved that bowl from a single piece of maple during the harsh winter when Samuel was 8 years old. "Every creature deserves to eat with dignity," his father had said, while shaping the wood with patient strokes of his knife. "A wounded animal is still deserving of respect." Now, watching Canyon eat from that same bowl, Samuel felt the weight of his father's wisdom in new ways. The lion's feeding ritual had evolved into something almost ceremonial. Canyon would wait until Samuel had withdrawn, then approach the bowl with a dignity that seemed incongruous with its broken condition. The animal ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not just the sustenance, but the small measure of autonomy the arrangement provided. It was during one of these feeding sessions that Mary Catherine O'Brien first appeared in Samuel's barn doorway, her slight frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. Samuel had heard her horse approach, but assumed it was Tom Brennan, making another of his increasingly frequent visits to check on what he called Samuel's folly. "Merciful heavens," Mary whispered, her Irish accent lending musical quality to the words. "Is that truly a mountain lion?" Samuel turned slowly, mindful of not making any sudden movements that might alarm Canyon. Mary stood perfectly still, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. At 28, she possessed the quiet competence of someone who had learned to manage a classroom full of frontier children, but her current expression suggested this was well outside her usual experience. "It is," Samuel replied softly. "Name's Canyon. He's been hurt pretty badly." Mary took a tentative step into the barn, her practical brown dress rustling against the doorframe. "Tom Brennan told me what you were doing, but I thought surely he was exaggerating." She paused, studying Canyon with the same careful attention she might give to a difficult passage in a book. "How badly hurt?" Samuel gestured toward the splinted leg. "Broken bones, torn muscles, deep gashes, fell from the cliff near as I can tell. Been nursing him for 6 days now." 6 days, Mary repeated as if testing the words. "And he hasn't, you haven't been killed?" "No, hurt, not yet." Samuel's voice carried a dry humor that made Mary's lips twitch upward despite her obvious nervousness. "Though there have been some moments when the outcome seemed uncertain." Mary had come to Samuel's ranch with a specific purpose, carrying a small leather satchel that contained medical supplies from the schoolhouse. Word of Samuel's unusual patient had spread through the small community, and while most reactions ranged from skepticism to outright concern, Mary had responded with characteristic practicality. "I brought some things that might help." she said, opening the satchel to reveal clean bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, and several vials of medication typically reserved for human patients. Dr. Henley left these when he passed through last month, said they were for emergencies. This certainly qualifies, Samuel replied, accepting the supplies with genuine gratitude, though I'm not sure Canyon will appreciate the attention. As if summoned by his name, the lion raised its massive head and fixed both humans with a steady golden gaze. Mary gasped softly but did not retreat, and Samuel noticed that Canyon's usual wariness seemed tempered by something approaching curiosity. "He's beautiful," Mary said quietly. "Frightening, yes, but beautiful in the way that wild things are meant to be." Over the following hour, Mary assisted Samuel in changing Canyon's bandages and cleaning the worst of the gashes with carbolic acid. The lion tolerated their ministrations with surprising patience, as if recognizing that Mary's gentle hands meant no harm. Her presence seemed to calm both patient and caregiver, and Samuel found himself grateful for her steady competence. "You've done this before," he observed as Mary expertly wrapped a clean bandage around a healing cut. "Not with mountain lions, certainly," Mary replied with a soft laugh. "But I've tended plenty of scrapes and cuts in the schoolroom. Children seem drawn to injury like moths to flame." "What made you come here today?" Samuel asked. "Most folks are telling me I've lost my mind." Mary paused in her work, considering the question. "I suppose because it takes courage to care for something that could hurt you. Too many people in this world are willing to destroy what they don't understand." Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience, but Samuel didn't press for details. Instead, he watched as she completed the bandaging with practiced efficiency, noting how Canyon seemed to relax under her touch in ways he had not with Samuel's care alone. When they finished, Mary stood back to observe their patient. Canyon had returned to his characteristic watchful repose, but something in his posture suggested a decreased level of anxiety. "Will you let me come back?" Mary asked as she prepared to leave. "To help, I mean, if you think it would be useful." Samuel considered the offer, recognizing that Mary's assistance had made the afternoon's medical care both easier and more effective. "I'd welcome the help," he said, "though I should warn you that not everyone approves of what I'm doing here." "I've never been much concerned with everyone's approval," Mary replied, with a smile that transformed her serious face. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed by kindness." As Mary rode away, Samuel reflected on how her presence had changed the atmosphere in the barn. Canyon seemed more settled, and Samuel himself felt less isolated in his unusual endeavor. For the first time since finding the injured lion, he began to think that his efforts might not be entirely foolhardy. That evening, as Samuel settled in for his nightly vigil beside Canyon's enclosure, he noticed the lion watching him with less suspicion than had become the norm. The animal's breathing was easier, and when Samuel carefully placed fresh water in the wooden bowl, Canyon didn't retreat to the far corner as he usually did. Instead, the great cat watched Samuel with golden eyes that seemed to hold a question neither could quite articulate. It was the first sign that the gulf between wild predator and human caregiver might be bridgeable, and Samuel chose to interpret it as progress worth the considerable risks he was taking. The second week began with a crisis that tested every skill Samuel had learned during his years as a cavalry medic. Canyon's splinted leg, which had shown promising signs of healing, developed a dangerous infection that threatened to undo all their careful progress. The telltale signs appeared gradually at first: increased warmth around the wound site, a subtle change in the lion's breathing pattern, and a restlessness that spoke of growing discomfort. By the third day of the second week, Canyon's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The infection had spread beyond the fracture site, creating angry red streaks that extended up the animal's leg toward more vital areas. Fever burned through the lion's massive frame, leaving him panting and barely responsive to Samuel's increasingly desperate attempts at treatment. Samuel found himself reaching for his father's military field surgeon kit, a collection of instruments. that had served Dr. Ezra Hartwell during his service in the Mexican War. The leather case, worn smooth by handling and marked with the stains of countless medical emergencies, contained scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and other tools that had been designed for battlefield medicine, where precision mattered less than speed and effectiveness. "I never thought I'd need these again," Samuel murmured to himself as he cleaned each instrument with carbolic acid, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of long-established routine. The tools were outdated by modern medical standards, but they represented the accumulated knowledge of a man who had saved lives under the worst possible conditions. The decision to lance the infected wound was not made lightly. Samuel understood that cutting into Canyon's leg carried enormous risks. He could damage nerves, worsen the infection, or provoke the semi-conscious lion into a defensive attack that would be fatal for them both. But the alternative was watching. The magnificent creature dies slowly from blood poisoning, and that was unacceptable. It was during his preparation for this desperate surgery that Mary arrived for her second visit, carrying additional medical supplies and wearing an expression of determined competence that suggested she had come prepared for serious work. "How bad is it?" she asked, taking in Samuel's grim expression and the surgical instruments laid out on a clean cloth. "Bad enough," Samuel replied, not looking up from his preparations. "The infection's spreading faster than I can control it. If I don't do something drastic, we're going to lose him." Mary approached Canyon's enclosure and knelt beside the fevered animal, her hand hovering over his massive head without quite making contact. "He's burning up," she observed. "What do you need me to do?" The question surprised Samuel with its directness. Most people would have questioned his judgment, suggested alternatives, or tried to talk him out of what was clearly a dangerous course of action. Mary simply accepted the situation and offered her assistance. "I need you to hold a lamp steady while I work," Samuel said. "And if things go badly, I need you to be ready to get out of here quickly." Mary's only response was to position herself where she could provide the best light, her steady hands holding the oil lamp without a tremor despite the obvious danger of their situation. Working by lamplight in the dim barn, Samuel made a careful incision along the infected area, allowing the accumulated pus and diseased tissue to drain. Canyon stirred weakly during the procedure, but seemed too weakened by fever to offer much resistance. The smell that emerged from the wound was nauseating, but Samuel had smelled worse during wartime and continued his work with steady concentration. For nearly an hour, he cleaned and debrided the infected tissue, using techniques his father had described in detailed notes that accompanied the surgical kit. Mary assisted with quiet efficiency, anticipating his needs and providing materials without being asked. Her presence transformed what could have been a desperate solo effort into something approaching professional medical care. "There," Samuel said finally, sitting back on his heels and wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's all I can do. Now we wait and see if it's enough." The waiting proved to be the hardest part. For 3 days and nights, Samuel maintained a constant vigil beside Canyon's makeshift bed, applying fresh poultices, monitoring the animal's temperature, and coaxing him to drink small amounts of water mixed with willow bark tea for the fever. Mary arrived each morning and stayed until sunset, helping with the medical care and providing the kind of steady companionship that made the long hours bearable. During quiet moments, they talked about their lives, their hopes, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together over the care of a wild predator. "Why are you helping me with this?" Samuel asked on the second night of Canyon's fever. Crisis, when the lion's labored breathing had them both worried that the end might be near. Mary considered the question while checking Canyon's pulse at the base of his neck. "I suppose because I recognize something in you that I've seen in myself," she said quietly, "the need to save something that others have given up on." "You speaking from experience?" Samuel asked. "I am." Mary's voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "My family was killed by a cougar when I was 16. Mother, father, and my little brother Danny. I was at the neighbor's house when it happened, helping with their sick baby." Samuel waited, sensing there was more to the story. "For years, I hated all predators," Mary continued. "Thought they were nothing but killers that deserved to be hunted down and destroyed. But hatred is exhausting, Samuel. It consumes everything good in a person if you let it." "What changed?" Samuel asked gently. Mary looked down at Canyon, whose fever had finally begun to break, leaving him in a deep, healing sleep. "I realized that the cougar that killed my family was just doing what nature made it to do. It wasn't evil, wasn't malicious. It was just hungry and desperate. And maybe if someone had shown it the kind of mercy you're showing Canyon, my family might still be alive." The revelation hung between them like a bridge, connecting their shared understanding of loss and the strange hope that could emerge from caring for something broken. On the third night, Canyon's fever broke completely. The lion woke clear-eyed and alert, accepting water from Samuel's hand for the first time since the infection had taken hold. More remarkably, when Samuel cautiously approached to check the surgical site, Canyon allowed the examination without resistance, even extending his injured leg, as if understanding that cooperation would make the process easier. "He's going to make it," Mary whispered, her voice filled with wonder and relief. "Yes," Samuel agreed, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I think he is." As they watched Canyon drink deeply from the carved wooden bowl, both humans recognized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship with the wild creature. What had begun as a medical emergency had evolved into a partnership built on mutual trust and respect, a partnership that would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. The third week of Canyon's recovery brought revelations that transformed Samuel's understanding of the creature he had committed to saving. What had begun as simple medical care evolved into something approaching communication as Canyon began to display the complex intelligence that marked him as far more than just another predator. The change was most evident in the way Canyon responded to Samuel's voice. The lion had learned to distinguish between different tones and inflections, raising his head attentively when Samuel spoke in the gentle cadence reserved for medical examinations, but remaining relaxed when Samuel simply talked. While going about his daily chores in the barn, most remarkably, Canyon had begun to show what could only be described as affection, extending one massive paw toward Samuel when the man approached, and making soft rumbling sounds that bore no resemblance to the threatening growls of their early encounters. "He's purring," Mary observed during one of her daily visits, her voice filled with wonder. "I've never heard of a mountain lion purring." "My father wrote about that once," Samuel replied, pulling out the worn leather journal to find the relevant passage. "Said he'd seen a wounded panther in Louisiana that made similar sounds when it was content. Thought it might be universal among the big cats." Samuel had been forced to improvise surgical instruments during Canyon's treatment, bending a hand-forged horseshoe nail into a probe that could reach into narrow wounds to remove debris and infected tissue. The nail, originally destined for his horse's shoes, had been heated and shaped with the same careful attention his father had brought to crafting medical instruments during his army service. It had become an essential tool in Canyon's care, precise enough for delicate work, yet strong enough to withstand the pressures of emergency surgery. Canyon's growing personality was matched by clear evidence of remarkable intelligence. The lion had figured out the timing of Samuel's daily routine, positioning himself near the barn entrance each morning to watch for his caregiver's arrival. He had also learned to differentiate between Samuel and Mary, greeting each with different vocalizations that suggested he understood their distinct roles in his care. More impressive still was Canyon's apparent understanding of his own healing. In process, the lion had begun participating actively in his physical therapy, stretching his injured leg in careful, measured movements that seemed designed to test his strength and flexibility. When Samuel noticed this behavior and began encouraging it with gentle guidance, Canyon responded with an eagerness that spoke of intelligent cooperation rather than mere animal training. It was during one of these physical therapy sessions that Mary made a revelation that recontextualized everything Samuel thought he understood about her motivations for helping with Canyon's care. "There's something I haven't told you about the cougar that killed my family," she said quietly, her hands busy with the task of cleaning Canyon's water bowl, while her eyes remained fixed on some distant memory. Samuel paused in his examination of Canyon's healing leg fracture, noting that the lion also seemed to sense the gravity of Mary's tone. "You don't owe me any explanations," he said gently. "Perhaps not, but I owe them to myself." Mary set down the bowl and turned to face Samuel directly. "The cougar that attacked our cabin wasn't hunting. It was wounded, limping badly, and probably desperate with pain and hunger. My father shot at it twice, but missed both times. He was never much with a rifle. The animal was defending itself, as much as attacking." She paused, gathering strength for the most difficult part of her story. "After the neighbors found me and we went back to the cabin, we tracked the cougar to where it had died from its wounds. It had been shot before, probably days earlier, and left to suffer until desperation drove it to seek shelter and food wherever it could find them." Samuel began to understand the deeper currents driving Mary's involvement in Canyon's care. "You think someone should have helped it instead of just wounding it and letting it suffer?" "I know someone should have," Mary replied with quiet conviction. "That cougar died in agony, and its pain led to my family's death. If someone had shown it the mercy you're showing Canyon, everyone might have lived." The weight of this revelation settled over them both as they continued their work. Canyon, as if sensing the emotional significance of the moment, moved closer to Mary and gently touched her arm with his uninjured paw, the first time he had initiated physical contact with anyone other than Samuel. Mary's eyes filled with tears at the gesture, and she reached out to stroke Canyon's massive head with trembling fingers. "He understands, doesn't he? Somehow he knows." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple, riders moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than social visiting. Samuel counted at least 6 horses, and the voices that carried across the canyon were raised in the kind of animated discussion that typically preceded difficult conversations. Tom Brennan arrived first, his face grim with the expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. Behind him rode 5 other men from the surrounding ranches, including William Hutchins, the territory's most successful cattle baron and a man whose opinions carried considerable weight in community decisions. "Samuel!" Tom called out as the group dismounted. "We need to talk." Samuel emerged from the barn, noting that Mary had positioned herself protectively near Canyon's enclosure. The lion, sensing tension in the humans around him, had risen to a standing position despite his injuries, the first time he had achieved this feat since his fall. "Gentlemen," Samuel said with careful neutrality, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" William Hutchins stepped forward, his imposing frame and expensive clothing marking him as a man accustomed to having his opinions respected. "Mr. Hartwell, we've come to discuss this situation you've created with the mountain lion. It's gone beyond personal choice. It's become a community concern." "In what way?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "That animal represents a threat to every family, every child, every head of livestock within 20 miles of here," Hutchins replied. "We can't have dangerous predators being nursed back to health so they can return to killing our cattle and threatening our families." Samuel felt Mary move to stand beside him, her presence offering silent support. "The animal is injured and recovering," he said calmly. "It poses no current threat to anyone." "Current being the operative word," said another rancher, a man named Peters, whose spread bordered Samuel's property. "What happens when that thing gets its strength back? You think it's going to remember your kindness when it's hungry and sees a child playing in a yard?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Samuel realized that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he made his choice at the base of the cliff. The community's patience with his unusual project had reached its limit, and now he faced a decision that would define not only Canyon's future, but his own place in the only home he had known since leaving the cavalry. Behind him, Canyon made a low sound that wasn't quite a growl, but carried enough warning to remind everyone present that the object of their discussion remained a formidable predator, injured or not. The sound seemed to strengthen Samuel's resolve, as if the lion was offering his own opinion on the proceedings. "Canyon stays," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the same authority he had used to command soldiers in combat. "That's not negotiable." The fourth week brought changes that forced Samuel to confront truths he had been avoiding since the day he carried Canyon into his barn. The lion's recovery had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. His mobility had improved. Dramatically, he was eating with healthy appetite, and his interactions with both Samuel and Mary showed a complexity that challenged every assumption about the relationship between humans and wild predators. Canyon had caught and killed a barn mouse with lightning-quick reflexes, demonstrating that his hunting instincts remained sharp despite his injuries. The successful hunt seemed to restore something essential to the lion's sense of self, and Samuel noticed a new confidence in Canyon's movements, a return of the natural grace that marked him as an apex predator. But it was a discovery in Samuel's cabin that brought the most significant revelation of the week. While searching for additional medical supplies, Mary had accidentally knocked over a small wooden box that Samuel kept on his bedroom dresser. Among the scattered contents was a faded daguerreotype that stopped her cold, a formal portrait of Samuel and a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the woman holding a small kitten in her lap. Samuel found Mary sitting on his front porch, the photograph in her hands and tears streaming down her face. "Margaret," he said simply, settling beside her on the weathered wooden steps. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered, "and you loved her very much." Samuel took the daguerreotype with careful hands, his thumb tracing the outline of his wife's face through the glass. "More than I knew how to express while she was alive. We found that kitten half dead in a rainstorm, and Margaret insisted on nursing it back to health. Spent 3 days feeding it with an eyedropper, sleeping with it on her chest to keep it warm." "What happened to it?" Mary asked softly. "Lived 14 years. Samuel replied with a sad smile. "Died the winter before Margaret did, like it was. Waiting to make sure she'd be all right before it left." He paused, lost in memory. "She cried for days when that cat died, said it had been a gift, a reminder that love could heal things that seemed beyond saving." Mary waited while Samuel gathered his thoughts, understanding that this was a story he had never told anyone. "When Margaret died in childbirth, I thought that was the end of love for me," Samuel continued. "Thought maybe I wasn't meant to care for things that could be taken away. But watching Canyon heal, seeing him learn to trust again, it's like Margaret's still here, still teaching me about the courage it takes to love something fragile." "Is that what you're doing?" Mary asked gently. "Loving Canyon?" Samuel considered the question, watching through the cabin window as Canyon tested his strength by climbing carefully onto a stack of hay bales. "I'm learning that healing someone else can heal you too, if you're willing to let it." The moment of quiet understanding was shattered by the arrival of William Hutchins, riding alone this time and wearing an expression that suggested this was more than a social call. He dismounted with the confident movements of a man accustomed to getting his way and approached the porch with purpose. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss O'Brien," he said with a curt nod, "I've come to make you a final offer regarding your mountain lion." Samuel rose to face Hutchins, noting the emphasis on final and the way the man's hand rested casually near his sidearm. "I wasn't aware I was entertaining offers." $500, Hutchins said without preamble. Cash money, paid today, for you to turn that animal over to me for proper disposal. That's more than most men in this territory see in 2 years. The answer is no, Samuel replied calmly. Hutchins' face darkened. You're making a mistake, Hartwell. That creature is a menace to every decent family in this area. I've got a wife and daughter to protect, and I won't have them living in fear because of your misguided compassion. Canyon isn't a threat to your family, Mary interjected, standing to join Samuel. He's barely mobile, and even when he recovers, he'll likely return to his territory in the mountains. Will he? Hutchins challenged. And what about when winter comes? And game is scarce. What about when he's hungry and remembers there are easy meals to be had in barnyards and pastures? Samuel felt the weight of the daguerreotype in his pocket, Margaret's memory strengthening his resolve. Some things are worth the risk, he said quietly. Hutchins stared at Samuel for a long moment, his expression shifting from frustration to something approaching threat. You're endangering this entire community with your foolishness. If that animal hurts someone, anyone, their blood will be on your hands. And if I kill him unnecessarily, Samuel replied, that will be on mine. After Hutchins rode away, Samuel and Mary returned to the barn to find Canyon displaying behavior that surprised them both. The lion had positioned himself near the entrance, his body language alert and protective, as if he had been listening to the confrontation and understood the threat it represented. He knows, doesn't he? Mary observed. He understands that man, wants to hurt him. Samuel approached Canyon slowly, noting how the lion's posture relaxed when he recognized his caregiver. Animals are better at reading human intentions than we give them credit for. As Samuel checked Canyon's injuries, he was struck by how much the lion had healed, both physically and emotionally. The broken leg was mending well, the gashes had closed cleanly, and Canyon's eyes held none of the wild panic that had characterized their early encounters. But more than that, the lion had begun to show genuine affection, leaning into Samuel's touch, making soft vocalizations when either human approached, and displaying what could only be described as loyalty. Samuel, Mary said quietly as they prepared to leave the barn for the evening. What are you going to do when he's fully healed? You can't keep him forever. The question Samuel had been avoiding finally demanded an answer. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. Canyon belongs in the wild, but not necessarily in this area. There are mountains to the north where he could live without threatening anyone's livestock. And you'd be willing to let him go? Mary asked. Samuel looked at Canyon, who was settling into his evening rest with the contentment of a creature that felt safe and cared for. Love means wanting what's best for someone, even when it costs you everything, he said, unconsciously echoing something Margaret had once told him about that injured kitten. That night, Samuel lay awake thinking about the photograph, about Margaret's belief in the healing power of love, and about the impossible bond that had formed between a broken man and a wounded predator. Outside his window, he could hear Canyon moving restlessly in the barn, as if the lion too sensed that their time together was growing short and change was inevitable. The morning would bring new challenges, new threats, and new decisions about Canyon's future. But for now, Samuel found peace in knowing that he had honored both his wife's memory and his father's teachings about the courage required to heal what others had given up on. The 5th week began with a decision that would change everything Samuel thought he knew about Canyon and the circumstances that had brought them together. The lion's recovery had progressed to the point where serious consideration of his eventual release could no longer be postponed, and Samuel realized he needed to understand more about Canyon's original territory before making plans for his return to the wild. The morning mist still clung to the canyon walls when Samuel set out on horseback, following the game trails that led to the cliff face where he had first discovered Canyon's broken body. The path was treacherous, winding through loose rock and sparse vegetation, but Samuel was determined to find Canyon's original cave and assess whether it would be suitable for the lion's return. What he discovered at the end of that perilous journey defied every assumption he had made about the mountain lion's past. Canyon's cave was larger than Samuel had expected, carved deep into the limestone cliff by centuries of wind and water. But it was not empty. Scattered across the floor were unmistakable signs of recent human presence. Torn fragments of cloth, a small leather shoe that had belonged to a child, and nestled in a corner where it had been carefully protected from the elements. A cloth, doll with button eyes and yarn hair. Samuel picked up the doll with trembling hands, his mind racing to piece together the implications of what he was seeing. The fabric was relatively new, certainly not weathered enough to have been there for more than a few months. The doll had been made with care, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a mother's love for her child. "What have you been hiding?" "From us, Canyon," Samuel murmured, examining the other artifacts with growing amazement. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Samuel emerged from the cave, he encountered Jim Crow Feather, a territorial tracker whose mixed Ute and Irish heritage had given him skills that made him invaluable to both law enforcement and private citizens seeking answers in the wilderness. "You looking for something specific up here, Samuel?" Jim asked, his weathered face showing mild curiosity rather than suspicion. "Trying to understand the animal I've been caring for," Samuel replied honestly. "Found some things in that cave that don't make sense." Jim's expression grew more serious when Samuel showed him the doll and described the other evidence of a child's presence. The tracker examined the items with professional attention, his fingers tracing the tears in the fabric and the wear patterns on the small shoe. "This is from the Hutchins girl," Jim said quietly, his words hitting Samuel like a physical blow. "Emma Hutchins. She went missing 3 months ago during that late spring blizzard, remember? The whole territory turned out to search for her." Samuel's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. "Emma Hutchins? William Hutchins' daughter?" "The same," Jim confirmed. "We found her 2 days after she disappeared, half froze, but alive. She was delirious from cold and couldn't tell us much about where she'd been or how she'd survived. Said something about a big cat that kept her warm, but we figured it was fever talk. The implications crashed over Samuel in waves. Canyon saved her life." Jim nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. "Looks that way. That mountain lion found a lost child in a blizzard and brought her here, kept her alive until the search parties could locate her." He paused, studying Samuel's face. "And William Hutchins has been demanding that same animal be killed, not knowing it's the reason his daughter is still breathing." Samuel felt the world tilt around him as the full irony of the situation became clear. Hutchins, who had been Canyon's most vocal opponent, owed his daughter's life to the very animal he wanted destroyed. The lion that the community saw as a threat had already proven himself to be a protector, saving a child when her own father and an army of searchers had failed to find her. "There's more," Jim continued, his voice heavy with uncomfortable truth. "Canyon didn't fall from that cliff by accident. He was shot at by some of the ranchers who've been complaining about livestock losses. They cornered him on a ledge, and when they started shooting, he had nowhere to go but down." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Canyon had been wounded while being hunted by the very people he had protected, shot at and driven to his near-fatal fall by men who saw him only as a threat to be eliminated. "Who shot at him?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Peters and 2 of his hands," Jim replied. "They've been bragging about it in town, saying they wounded a big lion and figured it crawled off somewhere to die. They were proud of it, Samuel. Proud of driving a wounded animal off a cliff." Samuel carefully tucked the cloth doll into his jacket pocket, handling it with the reverence due to a sacred object. This small toy represented everything that was. Wrong with the situation, a community's rush to judge and destroy what they did not understand, even when that judgment condemned the very creature that had saved one of their own. "I need to tell Hutchins," Samuel said finally. "He needs to know what Canyon did for his daughter." Jim's expression was skeptical. "You think that's going to change his mind? Man's got a lot of pride, and admitting he was wrong about the lion means admitting he nearly had his daughter's savior killed." "Maybe," Samuel replied, "but Emma Hutchins deserves to have the truth told about what saved her life, and Canyon deserves to have someone speak for what he did." The ride back to Samuel's ranch was the longest of his life. Every step his horse took brought him closer to a confrontation that would either vindicate his choice to save Canyon or condemn him as a fool who had risked an entire community for a creature that didn't deserve protection. But the doll in his pocket reminded him that truth had its own power, and sometimes that power was enough to change everything. When Samuel reached his barn, he found Canyon alert and watchful, as if the lion sensed that something significant had changed. Mary was there as well, having arrived for her daily visit, and her face showed immediate concern when she saw Samuel's expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Samuel replied, pulling the cloth doll from his pocket. "Mary, meet Emma Hutchins' guardian angel." As Samuel told the story of his discovery, Mary's eyes widened with amazement and growing understanding. Canyon, as if recognizing the doll, approached the bars of his enclosure and made a soft sound that was part recognition, part mourning. "He remembers her," Mary breathed. "Look at him, he remembers that little girl." Samuel watched Canyon's reaction to the doll with new understanding. The lion's gentle behavior, his remarkable intelligence, his capacity for trust despite his traumatic injuries, all of it made sense now. Canyon was not just any mountain lion. He was a creature capable of extraordinary compassion, one who had chosen to save a human child, even though experience had taught him to fear and avoid her kind. "What are you going to do?" Mary asked. Samuel looked at Canyon, then at the doll. That represented both salvation and condemnation, depending on one's perspective. "I'm going to give Emma Hutchins her doll back," he said quietly, "and I'm going to make sure her father knows exactly who returned it." The truth, Samuel realized, was about to set all of them free, or destroy everything he had worked to build. But after 5 weeks of caring for a creature that had already proven his worth through the ultimate act of selflessness, Samuel was ready to let Canyon's story speak for itself. The 6th week arrived with the weight of destiny pressing down on Samuel's shoulders like a physical burden. Canyon's recovery had progressed beyond even Samuel's most optimistic expectations. The lion moved with fluid grace, despite the slight limp that would always mark his left hind leg. His appetite was robust, and his golden eyes held the alert intelligence of a creature ready to reclaim his place in the wild. But it was not Canyon's physical healing that occupied Samuel's thoughts as he prepared for what he knew would be the defining confrontation of this entire ordeal. It was the moral complexity of what he had discovered, the terrible irony that threatened to tear apart everything the community thought it knew about predators, protection, and the true meaning of courage. Samuel had spent 3 sleepless nights, planning his approach to the inevitable community meeting that would decide Canyon's fate. Word had spread about Hutchins' ultimatum, and pressure was building from multiple quarters for a final resolution to what many saw as Samuel's dangerous obstinacy. The territorial sheriff had made it clear that he could not indefinitely protect Samuel's right to harbor a potentially dangerous animal, and several ranchers had hinted at taking matters into their own hands if official channels failed to produce results. In preparation for what lay ahead, Samuel had turned to the one source of wisdom that had never failed him, his father's worn Bible, a leather-bound volume that had provided comfort and guidance through the darkest moments of his life. The book fell open to a passage in Ecclesiastes that seemed written specifically for his current circumstances. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. Dr. Ezra Hartwell had marked this passage with careful annotations, notes about the physician's responsibility to choose healing over harm, even when that choice required extraordinary courage. Samuel traced his father's handwriting with reverent fingers, drawing strength from the knowledge that his actions aligned with principles that had guided good men through generations of difficult decisions. Mary had become his partner in preparing for the confrontation, helping him organize the evidence they had gathered and practicing the presentation of Canyon's story in ways that might penetrate the community's fear and prejudice. Her own transformation during these weeks had been as remarkable as Canyon's physical healing. The bitter anger that had marked her since her family's death had given way to a passionate advocacy for mercy and understanding. You realize that revealing the truth about Emma Hutchins might not change anything, Mary warned, as they reviewed their strategy for the 100th time. People have a remarkable capacity for rejecting evidence that challenges their established beliefs. Maybe. Samuel agreed, watching Canyon through the barn window as the lion performed his evening ritual of careful stretching and movement. But Emma deserves to know the truth about what saved her life, and Canyon deserves to have his heroism recognized instead of being condemned for crimes he never committed. Canyon himself seemed to sense that momentous changes were approaching. The lion had grown restless over the past few days, spending long periods staring toward the mountains with an expression that spoke of longing and incomplete purpose. His interactions with Samuel and Mary remained affectionate and trusting, but there was an increasing wildness in his movements, a reminder that despite their bond, he belonged to a world that existed beyond human understanding or control. Samuel had constructed a transport cage designed for Canyon's eventual relocation, whether to distant mountains or to whatever fate the community ultimately decided. The cage was large enough to allow the lion to stand and turn around comfortably, with ventilation and visibility that would minimize stress during transport. Building it had been both practical necessity and emotional preparation, a way of accepting that his time with Canyon was measured in days rather than weeks. The craftsmanship Samuel put into the cage reflected everything he had learned about Canyon's needs and preferences. The corners were rounded to prevent injury. The door mechanism was designed to open smoothly from the outside while remaining secure during transport, and the floor was lined with familiar materials from Canyon's recovery area to provide comfort and scent recognition. Working on the cage forced Samuel to confront the reality that had been growing stronger each day. Canyon was ready to return to the wild. The lion's injuries had healed as completely as could be expected. His strength had returned, and his natural instincts remained sharp and intact. Keeping him any longer would transform an act of mercy into an act of cruelty, confining a creature meant for freedom simply to ease Samuel's own loneliness. Jim Crow Feather had agreed to testify at the community meeting about Canyon's rescue of Emma Hutchins, lending credibility to what might otherwise be dismissed as Samuel's desperate fabrication. The tracker's reputation for honesty and his expertise in reading wilderness sign made him the perfect witness to corroborate the evidence from Canyon's cave. "You understand what you're asking of me," Jim had said when Samuel requested his help. "If I stand up for that lion, I'm going against some powerful men who've made up their minds about what needs to happen. I'm asking you to tell the truth," Samuel replied. "Nothing more, nothing less. Truth has a way of making enemies," Jim warned. "You prepared for that?" Samuel thought of Margaret's photograph, of his father's medical instruments, of the careful notes about healing that filled the margins of the old Bible. "I've been preparing for it my whole life, without knowing it. The night before the scheduled meeting, Samuel sat in the barn with Canyon, sharing what might be their final evening together. The lion had settled beside Samuel's chair with the companionable ease that had developed over their weeks together, his massive head resting near Samuel's feet in a gesture of trust that still amazed anyone who witnessed it. "Tomorrow, we find out if this has all been worth it," Samuel said quietly, his hand resting on Canyon's neck, where he could feel the steady pulse of the lion's heartbeat. "Either way, you've taught me things I didn't know I needed to learn." Canyon responded with the soft, rumbling sound that had become his expression of contentment, a vibration that Samuel felt as much as heard. The lion's eyes, no longer wild with pain and fear, held a serenity that suggested he understood something about their situation that Samuel was still struggling to grasp. Mary arrived as the sun was setting, carrying a basket of food and wearing an expression of determined optimism that didn't quite mask her underlying anxiety. They shared a quiet meal, while Canyon dozed peacefully nearby, the domestic tranquility of the scene masking the momentous events that awaited them. "Are you ready for this?" Mary asked, as they prepared to part for the evening. Samuel considered the question, thinking of all the ways the next day could unfold. "I'm ready to honor the choice I made when I found him at the bottom of that cliff. Everything else is beyond my control." "And afterward?" Mary pressed. "What happens to us? To you and me when Canyon is gone?" It was a question Samuel had been avoiding, but Mary's direct approach demanded an honest answer. Over the weeks of caring for Canyon together, their partnership had evolved into something deeper, a connection built on shared purpose and mutual respect that had grown into love. "That depends," Samuel said carefully, "on whether you can love a man who's learned to open his heart to things that might leave." Mary's answer was a kiss that tasted of hope and commitment, a promise that whatever the future held, they would face it together. As Samuel settled into his bed that night, he could hear Canyon moving restlessly in the barn. The lion's night. Sounds a reminder that some creatures were never meant to be fully tamed or permanently contained. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would test everything Samuel believed about mercy, justice, and the possibility of changing minds through the simple power of truth. The worn Bible lay open on his nightstand, its pages marked with generations of wisdom about the courage required to choose healing over harm. Samuel drew comfort from knowing that whatever happened in the morning, he had honored the best teachings of his father and the memory of his wife, choosing to mend rather than break, to protect rather than destroy. Outside his window, the mountains rose against the star-filled sky like silent witnesses to the drama that was about to unfold. Somewhere in those peaks, Canyon's true home waited for his return. But first, a community would have to decide whether a creature capable of saving a child's life deserved to live freely among them. Samuel closed his eyes and prayed for wisdom, for courage, and for the kind of grace that might allow truth to triumph over fear when the morning brought Judgment Day for a mountain lion named Canyon. The bronze bell that summoned the community to its most important gatherings had not rung with such urgency since the Apache raids of 1869. Its deep, resonant tolling carried across the canyon and drew settlers from homesteads scattered across 20 miles of harsh Utah territory, bringing together ranchers, farmers, merchants, and their families for a meeting that would determine not just Canyon's fate, but the moral character of the community itself. The schoolhouse had never held so many people. Every chair was occupied. Men stood along the walls, and women clustered near the windows, where they could catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the press of bodies and the weight of the August evening. Samuel noticed the careful way people positioned themselves, those who supported his right to care for Canyon on one side of the room, those who opposed it on the other, with a nervous middle ground occupied by neighbors who simply wanted the controversy resolved without violence. Sheriff Morrison called the meeting to order with the weary authority of a man who had seen too many community disputes escalate into lasting feuds. "We're here to settle the matter of Samuel Hartwell's mountain." "Lion," he announced. "Everyone gets to speak their piece, but we'll do it civil-like, and when it's done, we'll vote on what's to be done." William Hutchins rose first, his imposing presence commanding immediate attention. His expensive suit and commanding voice marked him as a man accustomed to having his opinions shape community decisions, and his opening words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Friends and neighbors," Hutchins began, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room, "we face a simple choice tonight. Do we allow sentiment to override common sense? Do we permit one man's misguided compassion to endanger every family? In this territory, murmurs of agreement rippled through his supporters as Hutchins outlined the case against Canyon with practiced rhetoric. He spoke of children playing in yards, of livestock grazing in pastures, of the fundamental responsibility of civilized people to protect themselves from wild predators that knew no law but hunger and violence. "Samuel Hartwell is a good man," Hutchins continued, his tone suggesting reluctant criticism of a valued neighbor. "But good intentions cannot change the nature of a killer. That mountain lion will never be anything but a threat to our families, and every day it lives increases the danger to innocent people." When Hutchins finished, the room buzzed with nervous energy. His arguments had been well-crafted and persuasive, appealing to the most basic fears that drove frontier life. Samuel felt the weight of opposing sentiment pressing down on him like a physical force. Sheriff Morrison nodded toward Samuel. "Your turn to speak, Samuel. Make it count." Samuel rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket where Emma Hutchins's cloth doll rested like a talisman. The faces turned toward him showed everything from sympathy to hostility, but he focused on the few that reflected genuine curiosity about what he might say in Canyon's defense. "6 weeks ago, I found a broken mountain lion at the base of Limestone." "Cliff," Samuel began, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Every practical instinct told me to put that animal out of its misery and be done with it, but something made me choose differently." He paused, letting his eyes move across the crowd before continuing. "What I've learned since then has changed. Everything I thought I knew about predators, about courage, and about the difference between killing and justice." Samuel gestured toward Jim Crow Feather, who stood near the back of the room with the patient stillness of a man comfortable with being the center of attention. "Jim is going to tell you about something that happened 3 months ago, something that will change how every person in this room thinks about the animal you want me to destroy." Jim moved to the front of the room with the quiet confidence of someone whose reputation for honesty preceded him. His weathered face showed no emotion as he began to speak, but his words carried the authority of first-hand knowledge. 3 months ago, Emma Hutchins disappeared during that late spring blizzard," Jim said simply. "We searched for 2 days before finding her alive but unconscious in the foothills. She was hypothermic, dehydrated, but alive, when by all rights she should have been dead." The room grew absolutely quiet as Jim continued. "Emma kept talking about a big cat that had kept her warm, but we figured it was fever dreams. Yesterday, Samuel showed me evidence from a cave high up on Limestone Cliff. Evidence that proves Emma was telling the truth." Jim pulled Emma's torn shoe from his pack, holding it up where everyone could see. "This belonged to Emma Hutchins. I found it in a mountain lion's cave, along with other signs that a child had sheltered there during the storm. That mountain lion, the same one Samuel has been caring for, saved Emma's life." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Gasps and exclamations erupted from different corners of the room as people struggled to process information that contradicted everything they believed about the situation. William Hutchins' face had gone pale, his confident demeanor replaced by something approaching shock. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mountain lions don't save children. they kill them. Samuel stepped forward, removing Emma's cloth doll from his pocket and holding it where Hutchins could see. This was in the cave, and too, William, carefully protected from the weather, like something precious being guarded. The sight of his daughter's beloved doll in Samuel's hands seemed to drain the last of Hutchins' certainty. His wife, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth with her hands as recognition dawned on her face. "That's Emma's," Mrs. Hutchins whispered. "She was heartbroken when she lost it, said her guardian angel would bring it back to her someday." The irony hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The man who had led the campaign to destroy Canyon was confronting the undeniable evidence that the mountain lion had saved his daughter's life, that the creature he wanted killed was the reason his child was alive to give him goodnight kisses and morning hugs. Samuel watched the struggle play out on Hutchins's face as the proud man grappled with a truth that challenged everything he had believed about the situation. The room waited in breathless silence for his response, understanding that this moment would determine not just Canyon's fate, but the kind of community they would choose to be. The silence that followed Jim Crow Feather's revelation stretched, like a taut wire ready to snap under the weight of collective shock. William Hutchins stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the small cloth doll in Samuel's hands, as if it held the power to rewrite everything he thought he knew about the world. "Emma," he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a father's love, and the crushing burden of almost unforgivable error. Mrs. Hutchins rose from her seat and moved toward her husband, her own face pale with the realization of how close they had come to destroying their daughter's savior. "William," she said softly, "you have to tell them." The proud cattle baron who had commanded this meeting with such certainty now looked like a man whose world had shifted beneath his feet. His hand moved instinctively to the silver pocket watch that his daughter had given him for his last birthday, the inscription on its case reading, "For Papa, with love from your guardian angel, Emma." "I need to say something," Hutchins announced, his voice rough with emotion. The room watched as he struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of his mistake. 3 months ago, my daughter Emma wandered away from our ranch during the worst blizzard this territory had seen in years. She was 6 years old, barely weighing 50 pounds, and she disappeared into a storm that killed grown men. He paused, looking around the room at neighbors who had joined the search parties, who had ridden for hours through freezing wind and snow to look for a little girl who seemed lost forever. "We found her 2 days later, unconscious but alive, and I never understood how she had survived when experienced outdoorsmen died in that same storm. She kept talking about a big cat that had kept her warm, but his voice broke slightly. I thought it was the fever talking. I thought she was confused." Hutchins removed the silver pocket watch from his vest, holding it up so the lamplight caught the engraved inscription. "My daughter calls herself my guardian angel, but it turns out she had a guardian angel of her own. A guardian angel that I've been trying to have killed for 6 weeks." The confession rippled through the crowd like a physical force. Some people wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, and many looked at Samuel with new understanding of what his choice to save. "Canyon had truly meant, Mr. Hartwell," Hutchins said, turning to face Samuel directly. "I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express, and I owe that mountain lion a debt that can never be repaid." Samuel stepped forward, offering the cloth doll to Hutchins. "What Canyon needs isn't payment. It's the chance to live freely in a place where he won't be hunted for crimes he never committed." Hutchins accepted his daughter's doll with trembling hands, cradling it as if it were made of spun glass. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help convince this community that Canyon deserves to be relocated safely to territory where he can live without threatening anyone's livestock," Samuel replied, "and I need your word that he'll be protected from anyone who might still want to hunt him." Without hesitation, Hutchins turned to address the assembled crowd. "I'm changing my position completely," he announced. This mountain lion should not only be spared, he should be honored. Any man who wants to harm the animal that saved my daughter will answer to me personally. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Voices that had been raised in opposition to Canyon now spoke of debt and gratitude. The fear that had driven the community's desire to destroy the mountain lion was replaced by something approaching reverence for a creature that had proven capable of extraordinary compassion. Sheriff Morrison called for the formal vote that would determine Canyon's fate. All in favor of relocating the mountain lion to safe territory in the northern mountains, signify by raising your hands. Nearly every hand in the room rose. The few holdouts found themselves isolated and outnumbered by neighbors who had been transformed by the truth about Canyon's heroic act. "The motion carries," Sheriff Morrison announced. "Samuel Hartwell is authorized to relocate the mountain lion to suitable territory where it can live without threatening local livestock." As the meeting dispersed, people approached Samuel to offer assistance with Canyon's transportation and relocation. The same community that had gathered to demand the mountain lion's destruction now volunteered to ensure his safe passage to freedom. William Hutchins was among the last to leave, approaching Samuel with the humility of a man who had learned a profound lesson about the danger of rushing to judgment. "I want to contribute to Canyon's relocation," Hutchins said, removing his silver pocket watch and offering it to Samuel. "This is the most valuable thing I own, not because of the silver, but because of who gave it to me. I want you to have it as payment for caring for Emma's guardian angel." Samuel looked at the watch, understanding the gesture's significance. "Keep it," he said gently. "Emma's going to want to hear all about how her guardian angel is doing in his new home." Hutchins nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." As the crowd filtered out into the night, Samuel stood in the empty schoolhouse with Mary beside him, both of them amazed by how completely the truth had transformed their community's understanding of courage, mercy, and the complex nature of predators and protectors. "It's over," Mary said softly, taking Samuel's hand. "No," Samuel replied, thinking of Canyon waiting in the barn for news of his fate. "It's just beginning. Tomorrow we take him home." 3 weeks after the community meeting that had changed everything, Samuel stood at the edge of a mountain meadow 60 miles north of his ranch, watching Canyon take his first tentative steps back into the wild. The transport had been successful, the lion showing remarkable calm during the long journey to territory where elk and deer were plentiful, and human settlements were sparse enough to ensure peaceful coexistence. Canyon paused at the open door of his transport cage, his golden eyes surveying the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched before him. For a moment, Samuel wondered if the weeks of human care had damaged something essential in the lion's wild nature, if comfort and safety had made him incapable of surviving on his own.